Hello, everybody. Looking at Chapter 30 now, the Great Depression, World War II. So we'll be looking at the Depression, unemployment, a little bit of the U.S., but not spending much time on the United States. Worldwide effects, the rise of authoritarian states, fascist states, the spread of communism, of course, and then World War II. We'll be going through World War II in this chapter. So there's a lot to cover in this chapter, a lot of important things. We start with the Depression, 1929. Began in 1929 due to a U.S. stock market crash. It ended up sending the entire industrialized world, the globe, the industrialized states, into basically a worldwide depression. It became a global depression within the next year or two. And was the worst depression to ever hit the United States. We've been through a lot of them, but the worst overall effects to hit us. And because global markets were deeply intertwined by this time period, and we were one of the largest economies on the planet, when we went down, we basically took everyone down with us. The U.S. stock market crashed, leaving Wall Street investors financially crippled. This happened in October of 29. Investors had been buying on margin. Basically, I'm not going to get into it, but basically buying a little bit of what a stock was worth, borrowing all the rest in hopes that the stock would go up, and then they would be able to cash out and make high profits. The problem was a lot of banks were doing this too, and this is what really hurt us. It was common banking practice at the time to basically take all our investments that we did into the banks, and then to invest those in the stock market. But all through the 20s, the stock market looked like this. It just went up and up and up and up, basically from 19, 20, 21, all the way to 29, and so people were making just money as fast as they could invest it, tons of cash. Well, the stock market crashes. It goes down fast. There's a massive sell-off. It recovers slightly, goes down again. And over the course of the next, basically 6 months, it loses almost 90% of its value. Really bad. We see this mass sell-off, and just in the next days and weeks, we see millions and millions of people lose their entire life savings, everything they had, gone. And, of course, there's mass financial chaos. The U.S. government had been assisting a lot of European nations recover from World War I. We'd invest billions of dollars in Europe. These countries' financial systems were intricately connected to us, our government, our financial system. Again, it was industrial worldwide markets, all connected. And so when we went down, we dragged everyone else down with us. Millions of people across the world found themselves financially destitute as everyone tried to withdraw their money. Banks closed, ran out of money. Banks had invested, some banks had invested 80-90% of their entire deposits into the stock market. Boom, all gone. When everyone comes knocking on the door asking for their money, the banks are like, we don't have it. Sorry. Yeah, we see countries across the globe, industrial production comes to a standstill. They stop importing goods, exporting goods, which therefore hurts other countries because you have other countries that are dependent upon American exports, imports, English, British, the British, the French, and all the other countries, imports, exports. And once you cut off half of that, it hurts everybody. This is quickly followed by mass unemployment. Again, if the goods aren't going, if people aren't buying products with their money, if they're not manufacturing products anymore, that's where primarily people were employed, was in manufacturing in the industrialized nations. And so we see no money being spent. We see mass business cuts. Businesses go out of business. We see demand for goods drop dramatically. Production orders slow. Employees are quickly laid off due to lack of work orders. And of course, once that happens, it's a spiraling effect. If the people aren't working, they're not making money, so they can't spend to buy goods. So we already have all this production layoff already, and then it's further exacerbated by the millions and millions of unemployed, which don't have money, can't spend goods, and then we see production further drop even more because the demand basically stops. many goods. The demand dwindles down to, almost nothing for a lot of goods. These layoffs meant no paychecks, but also added to lack of spending, as I said. Sales drop, reduction in production drops even further, and therefore there's even more unemployment, and it becomes basically this cycle. Rinse and repeat, and it just gets worse and worse and worse over the coming, the Depression didn't really hit its height, the absolute worst in the U.S., until 32, 33. So this is terrible at the beginning, and it just gets worse and worse and worse for several years. Worldwide unemployment, 15 to 33%. The United States, by 1933, hit approximately 25% nationwide employment. Anything over 5% is concerning. Anything over 10% is basically a national emergency. If you're reaching 10% unemployment, that's like a national emergency. I mean, we're talking about tens of millions of people unemployed. 20, 30%? Unemployment like that can cause countries to literally collapse. Entire countries, empires can just collapse. Never to be recovered. Governments are lost. It can destroy everything. We didn't fall into that basket. We got lucky. We had a relatively stable country in other ways, and we had a very stable economic and political system, generally speaking, compared to most places. We were able to survive this and weather it. Many other countries did not. This worldwide unemployment destroyed several countries, as we'll talk about. Louisville flood victims. This is 1937, still the height of the Depression. Gives you an idea of people standing in line, looking, and what makes the picture so great is I don't know the right word to use here, this dichotomy of the people standing in line, poverty, holding baskets, hoping to get food, hoping to get water, hoping to get bread or anything, waiting in line, behind this huge picture on the back, world's highest standard of living, no way like the American way, all white family, nice car, and the dog. It is polar opposites. Racial, economically. This was before the war. That was a sign from before. The 1920s was an incredible period in American history. In worldwide history, we see incredible economic growth and expansion. Think for a moment about the attitudes towards the photographer here. The lady was a middle-class white woman, probably dressed nicely. She's got photography equipment, probably trying to do interviews. Look at the faces of most of the people. Either they're completely ignoring her, or the couple that are looking towards her look basically like, what are you doing? Why are you taking pictures of us in front of this sign? Suspicion, concern. Of course, racial issues were front and center in America, had been, forever. What do you think a lot of them think of her? Standing there in her nice clothes. Again, she wasn't rich, but she was a comfortable middle-class woman, a daughter of an engineer. I believe her name was... I have her name. Bork White was... Yeah, that's the last name I have. Was it on the screen here? Oh, it is Margaret. Sorry, it's right there at the bottom. Margaret Bork White. What do they think? What do you think they thought of her, and why she was taking a photo of him in front of this big picture? Obviously, for us looking at it, we can look at it and say this affluent white family in the car with the kids, this idea of success and prosperity, juxtaposed with these poor black families that are victims of a flood and victims of the Depression, just looking for help. Some could maybe, especially in the black community, might see this as a way, I don't know, maybe as a way to I don't want to say make fun of exactly, and it wasn't. That was not her intent. She was trying to show, she was a journalist basically, she was trying to show the differences here between the way it was before and after. The before, the 1920s, everything was great. Everything was wonderful. Everyone was about buy now, pay later, buy cars, buy homes, And there was a big focus in advertising almost exclusively on whites, white middle class. And then these folks in front. You have to wonder what they thought about it, what they thought of her, if they thought they were being targeted in some way, or if this could somehow come back against them. Yeah, it's interesting. You'll also see a lot of imagery in this time period that often portray people, black people, people of color, as poor, as dirty, or without self-respect. The reality is, immigrants, minorities, women were hit the hardest by this. Absolute the worst, had the most challenges, the most issues of the Depression. It's hard to really even compare it. We see unemployment rates among whites of anywhere from the 10 to 20%, but among African Americans, 50 to 70%. Minorities, immigrants in general, unemployment rates 2 and even 3 times higher than we see for whites. So they were often left in the worst situations, the worst positions, the least amount of money, the worst housing, the worst jobs. There's nothing they could do about that. It was difficult living as a minority in America before the Depression, finding proper and sufficient housing and employment, much less after the Depression occurs, when there is very limited employment, very limited jobs available, and housing available, because the population kept increasing. People kept having kids, the U.S. population kept growing, and yet there was no one building houses anymore because of the Depression. The jobs. It gives a very poor image of how minorities were portrayed, but it's not their fault, or they're not doing anything wrong. But because that is an image that's portrayed in media at the time, in newspapers and in popular media, radio, they have to deal with it on a daily basis. And the last thing you need to think about, it comes to me anyway, is this idea of does she have an agenda? I mentioned that she's wanting to juxtapose this how it was before and after. But is she also thinking that maybe this might in some way show maybe how the American dream was never really for people of color? Even before the Depression, it was entirely focused. Media, advertising, politics, stores, they were almost exclusively focused on the whites and the middle class. So even before all this happened, is she trying to show that this dream, this American dream, the American way over here, it was never really for them anyway. It was never really ever targeted or ever for minorities or blacks, immigrants, ever. You have to wonder if she did believe that, if that's what she was trying to do. I don't know. It's reasonable to think that, though. It's a really good image, and it really shows and says a lot about America during and pre-Depression. The New Deal in the United States. FDR... he was president through most of the Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was elected in 1932. Hoover was the president. Really, I guess technically for the first 4 years it was Hoover, when all the Depression got worse and worse and worse. Hoover was elected right before the Depression began. So he was president for the first 4 years. But FDR came along, elected in 1932, when the Depression was at its worst. And he promises to try to fix America. He'd done all kinds of innovative programs in New York. He had been, I think he'd been governor of New York, either governor or the state or mayor of the city. And he had all kinds of innovative programs. And he managed to get the Democratic nomination and win the presidency. He instituted what he called the New Deal. This is his plan, his promise to America because all that mattered when he became president was the Depression. That's all that mattered. He authorizes all kinds of programs, often referred to as alphabet agencies, and there's dozens of these different agencies, all these different alphabet terms. And I go into real detail on that in the American history course. I'm not going to spend much time on that here. I focus on most of the rest of the world, not the U.S., in the world history class. all these different programs. Primarily, they were designed to do two things: put people to work and stimulate the economy. And of course, there's 100 ways. This is 100 aspects to this, but put people to work to fix the unemployment issue and to get the economy going back, and basically to get the economy running again. He did have to raise taxes. We do see taxes. We see many people for the first time paying an actual income tax. Many folks never paid income tax before. We see that. We see increased taxes on the rich significantly. We see increased taxes on the rich. Again, these were alphabet agencies often, and they were welfare programs. They were social welfare programs. For the first time in America, really contrary to the idea of the American dream and the American idea of self-reliance and the self-made man, which had basically been instrumental to the idea of what it was to be American for, well, basically since the beginning, was the idea of self-reliance, self-made man. Simply put, if you were successful, it's because you did it. Not because I did it, not because the government helped you. If anything, people want the government to get out of the way. Small government is the way we've pretty much been always in our history. Your success was based on you. You and your family. Not anyone else giving it to you. This time period changes. This time period, so many people, literally tens and tens of millions of people unemployed, can't work, can't find jobs. They're dying, they're starving, their kids are starving, they're just begging for help. And the government, under the New Deal, steps in and starts doing this. By the end of the 1930s, we have instituted a welfare state in America, to where a large percentage of the population gets welfare of some sort. And the reality is, almost every American today gets welfare. Many people won't admit to it, many people won't say it, but Social Security, which 95% of all Americans will use before they die, Social Security, is welfare. Social Security is created during this. It's one of the alphabet agencies created. Social Security Administration. It's created here. It is maybe the most important and significant welfare program in the United States. And when all these folks rail against welfare and all these welfare social programs, while I'll admit maybe sometimes there's some valid arguments to be made, the reality is all those people are going to use Social Security sometime in their life. That is the most significant welfare program of the United States. The biggest, the most expensive. It is equivalent to all other welfare programs combined. Funny how they don't have a problem with that. I want my Social Security. I earned it. That's a welfare program. Anyway, so we do institute this basically welfare society in the United States. That we did not have before. All kinds of different things. Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, is an interesting one. I'm only going to touch on a couple here. It basically regulated the farms because we needed to make sure at the end of the day, if you don't have a job, you don't have housing, the one thing you have to have is food. Everyone has to eat. Everyone has to have food, especially children. There has to be food access. And so they create this large agency that basically regulates the cost of food, regulates how food is grown, who grows the food, all kinds of things. Regulate the prices to make sure people get fair prices. And it still is really, really, during the Depression, this becomes the base of the entire American economy is agriculture. And that's one of the things that really stimulates Southern California. Southern California and the Southwest states become huge in agricultural production. They always had been, but the idea of Orange County, Southern California, the whole citrus, all of which really the water that came into Southern California, the whole, I'm totally blanking. All of the water that comes in, that supplies to all the crops and everything that basically makes Southern California green comes during this time period. Another agency is the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. It's designed to put as many people to work as possible, to work constructing bridges, roads, buildings, other public structures, basically anything we think of as infrastructure. Anything that's made of concrete, steel, iron, roads, bridges, parks, gazebos, national parks, schools, city halls, almost anything that could be think of as a public building or a public structure. At one point in the mid-30s, about 1/5 of the entire U.S. population, working population, 1/5 of the entire working population worked for one of these agencies. There was the WPA, the PWA, the CCC, I don't know, and there were others. The CWA, yeah, they all worked doing this stuff. This was basically the government paying people to work. And this isn't suits and ties and dresses. This is people working out doing construction. This isn't military. That's a whole separate thing. These are laborers working, building things from coast to coast, all the borders, all across the country. This is the core of the New Deal, really, putting people back to work. Social Security, of course, develops this national system of pensions for the elderly citizens known as Social Security. Money would be deducted from your paycheck regularly, a small amount, held by the government until you're retired, and then you qualify to get that money back. Initially, it was a very small program, only affected certain people, the elderly, 60 plus, and then it changes to actually help widows and to help people who are disabled, disabilities of some sort, whatever the disability was, physical disabilities, eventually mental disabilities as well later. The program is expanded and changed many times over the years, and it is unanimously, that's the wrong word. Majority of Americans consider it to be the most significant and important social government program that people care about. It's basically guaranteed money in your old age. The most disadvantaged groups in this time period, age group, was the very young and the very old. It's tough to get a job if you're an able-bodied, middle-aged person, 20, 30, 40-year-old person. Almost impossible to work, to find a job. Unemployment among those that were 60 plus was like 80, 90%. So it was a program designed to really help the elderly, who were one of the most disadvantaged groups in general. We could spend the whole class doing the U.S. in the Depression, which I actually do in the U.S. course. So let's go on and move to Europe. European response. European markets, of course, were heavily tied to the U.S. markets. We had to, due to us doing a large part assisting, helping recover after World War I, and, of course, all the different trade deals. Scandinavian states went even further into that. They went to even stronger and higher social programs during this economic downturn to try and help their citizens. These states incurred massive debts, trying to employ people in public projects, public welfare to keep people surviving. These states, we did extreme social programs in America for America. Many of these other European states, especially the northern European states, did even more than we did. Protective tariffs were placed on imported goods, basically making it much more expensive to import goods into a country. That's the purpose of the tariff. Basically, it's a tax on the imports. And reason you do that is there's a big tax on imported goods, which encourages companies to not import goods, but to make them at home. That's the idea. Making it much more expensive to import goods and products and materials into the country, which encourages businesses to manufacture their own goods, manufacture goods at home, which gives jobs, which stimulates your own economy instead of taking goods from other countries. It gives jobs to your own population. It's interesting. At its outset, it's worse. At its outset, it means you have a real scarcity of goods because suddenly the supply drops off. You can't buy anything because we're not importing it anymore. But in the longer term, that forces companies or encourages companies to build products within the country. Therefore, ultimately, it puts people to work and helps the economy. But it takes a while for that to work. It can sometimes take years for that to actually fully incorporate. So in the short term, many people didn't like it. It hurt businesses. It hurt people. You couldn't buy anything because you couldn't find the goods. But the idea is to generate income in country domestically. That was just one of their ways of doing it. France had a popular front. They organized by French communists, radicals, and socialists who were concerned about fascism. Fascism, of course, growing in nearby Germany, for instance, in Italy and Spain. Certainly concerned about the growing power of other fascist, very strongman, dictatorial governments, which we'll talk about. This alliance, this idea of Popular Front, it was often inspired by New Deal programs. It eventually collapses, leaves the country open to influence by Germany, and it's thought that this idea of France trying to emulate America might have actually hurt them in the long run and left them open to German influence and eventually German invasion. We were very self-reliant in the United States in World War during the Depression because we literally had no one else to help us. But we didn't really need it. We had every type of resource, natural resource. We had all the forests and the mines and the rivers. We had everything we needed in this country. We just weren't utilizing it all adequately, and the Depression forced us to do that. Once we came to fully rely upon ourselves, it took several years for us to come out of it. But by 1939, we were the most powerful country in the world, other than perhaps Germany. Perhaps Germany was equal, but other than that, no other country in the world matched our economic power, or once 40 and 41 comes around, our military power. But our economic industrial might by 1939 and 40 is unmatched by anyone other than perhaps Germany, because we became entirely self-reliant. We had to shift how our entire society functioned to basically it was all made in the USA. Now, of course, it wasn't all. That would be stupid to say. There were still things that were being imported, of course. But primarily, we came to focus and rely on ourselves. France had a problem because France was so heavily reliant on its colonies. All of those were basically dissipating in this time period. The colonies were disappearing, all the independence movements we talked about. And then, of course, on top of that, they had a really powerful neighbor of Germany, which was doing great. This Depression worked wonderful for Germany. They came out of the Depression as, again, maybe the most powerful state in the world, maybe. Certainly the most powerful state in Europe. This Depression was wonderful for them. It basically allowed them to create a powerhouse economy and create a powerhouse military. But the reason it's significant here is because right on their border was this powerhouse everything, doing everything right and growing powerful and having a great economy and having a huge growing middle class, while France was going in the shitter. And it's kind of like the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, right? Things are bad here, we look over there and everything's great. And so this really helped Germany influence France, and which really helped that when the war started, Germany basically just took over France as soon as the war began. It was actually quite easy for them to do this. But yeah, you get all these communists, socialists, radicals. Now, there was a Popular Front in the U.S., too. We had a communist, sympathetic Popular Front in the United States. People talked about how that might be a way to deal with this. There was definitely socialist leanings. And many people would say much of the New Deal was socialist. Some of it was, certainly. So this was a very turbulent time. The Depression combined with all these new political ideologies, fascism and socialism. It was confusing. This is interesting. This is an ad. This is another one of these propaganda ads. The Conservative Party was focused on protectionism. This protectionist trade, the idea of trying to help the Depression, sort of what we just talked about, these protectionist tariffs. Many people blamed stuff, and this is really showing that they're blaming a lot of the problems with the economy in England from all the stuff. Buying goods from Japan, from Czech, from Belgium, from the U.S., made in Germany, grain from Russia. The Conservative Party is basically pushing all these protectionist tariffs. Let's stop buying all these foreign goods. Let's make them ourselves. Let's put our people to work. And the Conservative Party became very strong. It became actually the most powerful party, political party in England for a very long period of time, for decades. It's still very powerful, actually. And they were making this argument that we shouldn't rely on other countries. We should take care of ourselves, which is kind of what the U.S. did. Maybe not to the extreme that England did, but this is a political thing. This certainly appeals to people to vote to the workers. These are probably dock workers here, people working on the dock, which are basically regular laborers. certainly trying to appeal to the working laboring class, which is interesting because there was also a political Labour Party in England. That was the name of the party, the Labour Party, which supposedly represented the interest of the labor, the working man. It's interesting. This was, politics played heavily into this. You could not get elected in this time period in the 1930s, anywhere, in an industrial nation, anywhere, without directly addressing the Depression. That was the single most important issue to pretty much anybody in any industrial nation. Politics and your position in politics depended upon how you addressed and whether you successfully addressed issues people were concerned about the Depression. The worldwide effects of the Depression. Colonies had very strong economic ties to European powers. England, for instance, the United States, who were the hardest hit. Two of the hardest hit nations. Often based on individual commodities. The colonies were almost often based on individual commodities. An entire colony's production wrapped up in either rice or tea or sugar. Therefore, as opposed to a very diversified economy, if one product is doing poorly, other products will compensate. When you have a colony that almost entirely, their entire economy is based on just rice or tea, for instance, if no one's buying rice or tea or the price drops dramatically, then basically your entire state just crashes. No one's working. Unemployment in some of these colonies at certain times of the Depression reached as high as 80%. Basically, no one was working. Very bad. Very, very bad. We see global market avoidance, imperialism. For instance, Japan. Japan nationalists called for less dependence on global markets. That was kind of common. Demanded that Japan expand its empire and grow to have access to new materials, new markets, and new products. Japan's first step was to invade Chinese Manchuria, which we talked about that. They invaded Chinese Manchuria in 31, I believe, 1931. And then they slowly start to spread across the Pacific, South Pacific, into much of, basically the islands, most of the islands off the coast of China, Japan, Southeast Asia, all the way down towards Indonesia. To, again, look for raw materials, look for markets, look for new opportunities for their goods and more products, expanding their shipping. Isolation and protection was a common tactic. Talked about this, what England was doing. Countries and colonies that produce goods like tea, rubber, tin, cocoa, coffee, often devastated by these imports and protectionist trade policies. Again, if a country refuses to import a particular good, and they imported a huge amount of that good, then the colony that exported that good is really screwed. If no one's importing cocoa, then the colonies in South America that export cocoa, basically their entire economy shuts down. Pretty bad. Lots of lack of economic confidence, increased more of these isolationist, protectionist policies. We see this crippling the world market even further. Brazil, for instance, had a situation where they couldn't, it was so bad that we see some countries, and Brazil is a great example, they had warehouses, dozens of warehouses full all over the ceiling with coffee beans. No one was buying coffee for these protectionist tactics. They stopped buying coffee. And so what happens, Brazil can't sell it. They had nothing to do with it. It's going bad. So they just burned them all. Millions and millions of bags, millions and millions of pounds of coffee just burned. Nothing to do with it. They can't get rid of it. Burn it all down. Build something over the ashes, clean it off, and start building all over again. The amount of money that was lost to these types of tactics of these European countries, I've never seen a number, but I'm sure in the long run it had to be billions of dollars just disappeared, burned away, or went bad, spoiled, wasted. Crops. We see that happen in sugar plantations. No one was buying the sugar. We see sugar imports drop dramatically, and so what they did was they just let the fields just go. The fields just go bad. All the crops, all is just wasted. Just rots on the sugar cane, however that works. Corn, for instance. They leave corn and it would just rot on the stem. Yeah. Economic nationalism, we see this develop. Populations begin to resent each other. The situation they often find themselves in, because the world had always been economic trade competition. And so my country used to import goods from you. Your country used to import goods from me. Now I've got protectionist tactics. You've got protectionist tactics. I'm not importing your stuff. You're not importing my stuff. Basically, we're all just screwing each other over to protect ourselves. This creates a lot of animosity, anger, frustration, chaos between different nations, different parts of the world. And the ones that were getting the most totally screwed were the colonies. Again, unemployment rates in the industrialized nations, 10, 15, 20, even as high as 30% in places. But we see unemployment rates double that in the colonies. 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, even in rare situations, we see as high as 80% in a few places. Yeah. So everything that's happening in industrialized nations, we can sometimes see it happening even worse in some of the colonies. Yeah. This allows places for fascist governments, totalitarian dictator governments, military warlords to move in and say, you know, we can take care of it, we can do it, the government isn't doing it. And of course they didn't. They usually just came in and made things worse. This becomes a real turning point in like Latin American, South American countries, African countries. We see almost all of these countries actively resist European interference, European colonization. We see an increasing calls for independence and freedom. But due to the chaos and the violence, and the fact that someone has to keep things in line, keep things in order, from the chaos and the riots and the marches and the protests and all of the turmoil going on in these countries, because all these unemployed men, this is really the problem. You've got millions and millions of unemployed men. 18, 20, 30, 20, 25, 30-year-old guys that all normally work, having families. They can't have families now. They can't feed their kids. We've got all these millions of unemployed men that have nothing to do now, that would normally be working in factories. It causes disturbances, and what we end up finding is a lot of these men are then enlisted in the military. They're enlisted, they're given jobs in military, given uniforms, given guns, and told, this is what you can do for us. You go out and you do things for us, you conquer enemies, you shoot the bad guys, you take over this, you conquer this village, you take over these people, and we'll pay you, we'll give you food. How you do it? Either we give it to you, or you go take it from someone else. We'll give you the guns, the training, and go take from them. Go take their stuff. Because we don't have enough, go take theirs. Yeah. And which often results in these totalitarian, fascist dictatorships that arise all across the world. Europe, Africa, South America, Asia. In many of these places, peace can only be achieved through gunpoint. These independence moves it's really ironic and sad. Many of these nations, they achieve independence from Europe, only to then basically be conquered by some type of warlord, totalitarian dictatorship, or some type of military power arises. They're still technically now independent, a lot of them. But they're now being run by some type of military power, military authority. And of course, the big ones that happen for World War II this happens in Germany, this happens in Italy, this happens in Japan, other places. All right, let's talk about the authoritarian states, which is really the basis of, this is what's sort of leading us into World War II. These authoritarian states that ultimately find the best way that they can survive and grow and prosper is to take from others. And this is really what leads us into World War II. We get these types of governments dominating the globe, with the exception of England, America, and a few countries that democracy does hold out, or some type of democracy holds out. Some type of republican, again, that's not a political party, but the idea of a republic, the idea of people having rights and freedoms and liberties. Some type of republican government surviving, or democratic, representative governments. England, America survives, some Scandinavian countries, Canada, Australia. Much of the British Commonwealth manages to hold on. England it can be said this isn't putting England off the hook in any way, but England generally, as far as colonial treatment, treats or negotiates and has policies with their colonies better than most countries. Better than most. Most British colonies kept and thrived. Or thrived would be the wrong word. Survived would probably be a better word. Most British colonies around the world continued to be successful. Even if they were hard hit by the Depression. Of course, everybody was. But they didn't go down in flames. But colonies of France, of Germany, of Spain, of Italy, of Russia, we see that, the Soviet Union, we see many of those colonies just collapse. Because those countries look so inward that really all they cared about was their own people, which is understandable. I get that. U.S., we did that. But they did have all these colonial holdings around the world that they basically just forgot about. England didn't do that. England, even with their protectionist tactics, they did often still continue to work with and have some trade and military protection of their colonies, which allowed them to maintain quite a bit of power. And going into World War II, the most powerful nation is Germany, but probably the second most powerful nation globally is still probably England, probably, economically, militarily, which gives them a great advantage. It's probably the only reason they were able to hold out against the Germans for so many years during the war. Dictators' needs, we have this obedient government, expectations. Basically, the government takes orders from the military. It's not like here in the U.S., the military works for the government. What we find in many cases in these authoritarian states, the government basically accedes to whatever the wishes of the military are. The military warlords and generals are the ones actually in power, and the government just sort of toes the line, given the impression. They often keep the governments. They sometimes have their own congresses and things like this. They even have presidents. Nominally, it appears that the government is still in charge. But in many cases, and for instance in the big three we're going to talk about, Germany, Italy, and Japan, the actual control of society is in the hands of the warlords and the generals. It gives the outward appearance the government's still running things, but it's not. It's really not. This happened in the Soviet Union too. The communist government in the Soviet Union, China as well eventually. Basically, the government comes to work for the military. Again, these dictators, oligarchs. Oligarch is when there's a small group of strong men running the government. They require obedient bureaucracies. They have to have vigilant police departments. Why? That should be obvious. You have to keep the people inside your country in line. The police are not about serving and protecting. The police are basically to keep and control the population. From uprisings, civil wars, internal issues. Basically, it's to keep their own people in line through physical means, intimidation tactics, terrorist tactics, imprisonment, restrictive laws and policies, you name it. And you, of course, have to have a powerful army. The army serves two incredible purposes. One, of course, to expand and grow and to bring resources into the country by basically taking from others. But secondly, the army is where you put all the youth. The army is where you put all your 18 to 30-year-olds. You take all those people, primarily men, you put them in there, you give them purpose, give them a job, give them a gun, give them training, you give them a guaranteed pay of food and money, and then you point them outward. Instead of looking inward at the country and looking at all the problems, you face them outward to the enemies and say, all around us, those are all enemies. Go get them. And that's really what happens. This huge focus on the other. The other being the enemy, the other being the bad, whatever the other is. The other can be politically different, the other can be racial, the other could be ideological, the other could simply be the people on the other side of that border. We're good, they're bad, go kill them. So the army serves a very, very important dual purpose. The expansion plus the employment of all of the unemployed. And giving them a purpose against the enemy. Gives them distracts them from all the real issues. Most populations that establish and support the established, the idea of a dictator, they want to avoid communist upheaval. It's really odd. They often adapt fascism because they're afraid of communism. Well, communism, the idea of communism is spread the wealth to everybody. Fascism is about holding the wealth for an elite group at the top. So they're worried about communism because communism is going to be like power to the people. And so these fascist governments are more focused on holding onto the power and wealth themselves at the upper tier, that top 10, 20%, holding on to all the power. And so we see them turn away from communist governments, which are military. So that they have the authoritarianism is very similar between fascism and communism, even though they're the two opposite sides of the spectrum. Communism is extreme liberalism, and fascism is extreme conservatism. So we have the two opposite sides of the spectrum, but militarily and authoritarian, very similar. Basically, all the power being held at the top by an elite group at the top, an elite section of society that basically controls everything else. Let's see what else we have going on here. Elite power and money to the landed wealth. Of course, landed wealth is the basis of most wealth in human history. We see these radical totalitarian dictatorships arise in the 20s and the 30s, often in response to ideas that appeared during World War I. Totalitarianism is this form of government that maintains complete political power, complete political control of all aspects of society, mobilizes the masses for a common cause, a common action, usually against the other for a national cause. We're superior to them, our society's better, our religion's better, our ideologies are better, our race is better, our language, everything. It's really this kind of extreme nationalism, this extreme nationalist idea. Whoever they might be, whoever the enemy is. Usually it is people who are neighboring outside our borders. And these are different, these are different sort of three governmental types that really fit into this mold. Communism is one. This is totalitarianism on the far left. Seizing private property, crushing the middle class, leaving only the poor and a very small military bureaucratic elite at the top. So you have that. You have this idea of communism here. Basically, you have this small elite at the top, and they hold all the power and takes away any type of status or private wealth from the middle and lower classes. All poor, small, elite military. You have right, you have extreme fascism, like Nazi Germany, for instance. Soviet communism, that's the Soviets. You have Nazi Germany, which is extreme, what we call this extreme right fascism, to the totalitarianism on the right. They didn't nationalize property, and they didn't necessarily crush the middle class. We don't necessarily see the middle class crushed. The middle class actually becomes core of the German society. You just got to make sure the power and status is in people who follow along. There is one group which basically leads. You have a stronger middle class. You have more wealth among the middle class, which allows you to have a more strong nation, which one of the things that made Germany so powerful is they were able to basically get the majority of their entire population behind them. And the people who were poor at the bottom were usually minorities, people of color, Jews, people who were not part of this German master race we'll talk more about. Nazis, like the Soviets, they did decide who, what, when, where. They controlled all aspects of society. They controlled public speaking, they controlled art, they controlled media, they controlled literature, they controlled everything. Total power in the hands of an elite at the top that decided everything. There was no freedom of speech, no freedom of press. There really was no freedom of thought either. Massive book burnings, burning and destroying anything, book bans, censorship, all these things like this are basically fascism. All this kind of stuff. Saying what you can't think, what you can't say, what you can do, what you should do, how you should act. This is all his fascist ideas. Often war was the big... Fascism can't survive without constant warfare. It really can't. Because you have to constantly focus your people's attention on an enemy of some sort. Because it's such a restrictive society, and basically it's all about groupthink, that you're told and controlled on what you should do, how you should think, how you should act, what you should read, what you should watch, where you should go, what leisure activities you should enjoy. You're basically told everything, and it's very controlled and very structured. And you're taught to like spy on other people and to tell anyone who steps out of line, tell on them. That intense pressure really only works as long as there's a constant focus of some type of an enemy, some type of an issue, some type of a problem constantly. So one of the ways to resolve that is with constant warfare. You constantly have an enemy, you're constantly at war, and you're constantly trying to hold everyone together, focused on a common enemy. You all have been very charismatic leaders. Hitler was certainly that. Hitler was a genius. Hitler was a charismatic leader. Pure evil, of course, but there's a reason he rose to the power to become the leader of the most powerful nation on the planet. And he, there for a while looked like he might actually take over the world, I mean, he had nothing less than that. His idea was nothing less. Mein Kampf, his struggle that he wrote about, made it very clear he wanted nothing less than to take over the world. Control the entire ideology of the planet. And you got to have propaganda. You got to basically keep working on people's thoughts. It is psychological. You have to constantly convince them to do this, not to do this, do this, not to do this. This is bad, this is good, this is bad, this is good, all the time. And the Germans were experts at this. Constantly controlled social media for the time, which would have been radio, constant state-controlled radio telling people exactly everything good and bad, what they should like, what they shouldn't like, who's good, who's bad, all the great things the government's doing. They had the largest movie industry in the world outside of Hollywood. They made all kinds of films, propaganda films, all kinds of groupthink films telling you what you should do and what you should like and what's good and bad, etc. Advertisements, on street corners, in magazines. They decided exactly what books could be written and how books could be written. It's crazy. It's cray-cray. But that's how fascism works, and it worked. It made Germany this powerhouse that allowed them to come close to taking over the world. Had they managed to get the bomb before us, we'd all be speaking German. I'm just saying, who knows? But had they managed to get the bomb before the United States, yeah. They had the capability to basically to be almost unstoppable. All right, so Lenin to Stalin. Let's look at the Soviet Union for a little bit. Some crazy stuff. You think crazy stuff's going on in Germany? Let's talk about some of this. 1921, Lenin launched his new economic policy, the NEP, which provided limited economic freedom so as to allow agriculture and industry to rebuild. Lenin granted peasants and small merchants the ability to sell their own goods, produced from their own small gardens, patch of land, or their own shops, trying to rebuild the nation. However, any other type of heavy industry was nationalized, meaning controlled by the government. Nationalized means it's controlled by the government, deciding what you build, what factories produce, what goods you make, etc., what you buy and sell. So this was Lenin's way of winning over the peasants by giving some economic freedom to the poor, winning over the peasants, which was the majority of the population, by at the same time controlling where the real money was, which was the industry, the factories. So giving some authority back to the peasants, making it appear as though the communism's working, the peasants have the power, they could have their own shops, grow their own food, have their own small farms, while having all the real industry, the real money, and the real product being produced, being controlled by the government. So sort of winning over the ideologies, winning over the peasants, because he had to worry about the peasants rising up, which was the majority. The peasants could rise up and potentially overthrow society, basically what he did, getting the peasants together to overthrow the czars, to overthrow society. He always had to worry about the peasant revolts. After all, that's what he talked about, wasn't it? His entire ideology of forming in the whole revolution and the Bolshevik and everything, the whole ideology was the peasants rising up in violent revolt to basically overthrow the leadership. Only now he finds himself as the leadership. So now he has to worry that the same ideology he used to basically take over Russia and form the Soviet Union is actually going to be used against him to overthrow him, which seems actually very logical. Same boss, or the new boss, same as the old boss, as that song goes. Yeah, because Russia was still heavily impoverished, going through a depression. The depression hasn't hit yet, but it's well, I read this actually in a book somewhere. This was actually talking about the Soviet Union during the Cold War, so years after this, and the comment was, and I'm paraphrasing, every day's depression in Russia. It's always like that. Don't need a Great Depression, it's just always like that in the Soviet Union. Let's see, the NEP begins to take shape. Lenin dies in 24. He passes in 24, leaving no actual replacement. We see rivals. We see sort of a little warfare go on, sort of a civil war between Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin. Stalin wins. Stalin takes over in 25 and becomes the new leader of the Soviet Union, taking over. Statues are built to Lenin. Lenin's a great hero, and Stalin becomes the real villain. Lenin was bad, Stalin's worse. Stalin is responsible for killing tens of millions of his own citizens. Yeah, he's definitely ranking up there in the top 10 of worst leaders and terrible, destructive leaders in world history. And Stalin's 5-year plans is often what does it. All right. So Lenin's NEP was abolished. It was shut off by Stalin, ended. His new economic policy. Stalin begins to set forth his own goals, what he calls 5-year plans. The economic objectives that were to be met within 5 years included a 250% increase in industrial output and a 150% increase in agriculture. 250% increase industrial, 150% increase agriculture over 5 years. That actually doesn't sound that unachievable. Agriculture, certainly. Industrial is a lot. 2.5 time increase is a lot. But, yeah. The peasants have received land, were now required to give up all their land, and we see collectivized agriculture, collectivization, which becomes what is sometimes thought to be the downfall of the Soviet Union, at least in its first 20 years. Collectivization is one of the worst things to ever happen, and responsible for such massive suffering that it's unbelievable. So they had to give up all their land, all their animals, all their tools, and basically become slaves. Not technically, but basically. De facto slaves on land. They give up their land, their livestock, their tools. Many refused. They were executed, or if they killed off their animals or burned their farms, which some did. When they were captured, they'd be executed or sent off to the prison camps. So basically, there was no private land anymore. Everything was owned and controlled by the government now. Why have a revolution now? It sort of removes the incentive for a lot of people to have a revolution. There is no private wealth anymore. There's nothing to really, if you have a revolution, you don't gain anything. There's no land available anymore. There's nothing to gain. The government controls everything now. Yeah, they really feared capitalism. They feared this idea of capitalism, the idea of individual self-enterprise, individual enterprise, none of that was allowed anymore. Everything in the Soviet Union was now for the good of the state. Your own life was nothing more than a simple piece in a machine or a piece in the puzzle, a grain of wheat in a bag of wheat. You were just one piece and you were there to serve the country. Your own individual life or needs were irrelevant. Might as well have issued serial numbers to the population. Yeah. Kulaks, which were better off peasants, basically they were the middle-class farmers. They were targeted for liquidation. Yes, that's a term we use, which means exactly what you might think it means. Extermination. To be killed, to be starved, or sent away to the camps, to re-education camps, they called them, which you never would ever come back from. Sent to prison camps, extermination camps, forced labor camps. Yeah. It's a horror story. It's nothing short of a horror story. We get this collectivized farms. Ukraine, for instance, were required to produce an impossible amount of grain that had been turned over to the government. You had to basically turn over everything the government required to hit the quotas before you were allowed to keep food for yourself. So it's very common for people to starve to death trying to meet the government quotas when they couldn't eat the food themselves. If they did consume the food themselves, or actually tried to sell some of the food at market to buy food for their families, and it was found out, they would be executed, sent to prison camps, re-education camps, etc. Just during the first 5-year plan, basically 25 to 30, 26 to 31, at least 5 million people died, primarily from either liquidation, re-education, or starvation. And that's just in Stalin's first 5 years. Stalin doesn't die until 52, I think. 53, something like that. So Stalin's in charge for almost 30 years. And just the first 5-year plan results in perhaps as many as 5 million dead as a result of all the things associated with it. You can see where that's going. Famine, mass death, millions dead. And who knows how many other millions over the years disappeared into the prison camps out in the frozen tundra of northern and central Asia, never to be seen again. Stalin, oh great Stalin. Soviet collectivization poster. They always like that color red, their color of communism. We got the red flag right in the middle. That is, oh, by the way, is a one party. That's another thing I actually didn't mention. Another aspect of these totalitarian governments, whether it be communism, fascism, is they're always one party systems. There's no political parties. It's one party that runs everything. We see this in Germany, Italy, Spain. We see this in Japan. We see this in where's another big country? It's China. We see one-party systems. And when they vote, everybody votes yes. That's the interesting thing about the voting. It's really interesting when they have these voting and these laws that are passed. If there's 500 people in their Congress, whatever their Congress is particularly called, all 500 vote for it every time. Because if you're someone who doesn't, you just basically signed your death sentence. You'll either be destroyed politically, your family be killed, or you'll be killed, or you go off to be re-educated, or your career's ruined. Even if you're not killed necessarily, you'll be in poverty, digging up turnips for the rest of your life. So when the general says we need a law passed for such and such, everybody in their Congress, their parliament, their whatever it's called, says, yes, sir. And they'll vote for it. These are all are one-party systems. Yeah. So you have this one party, the Soviet ideology, Communist Party. It was the vanguard of the revolution, protects everybody in this new modern socialist future. This modernization, of course, with this giant tractor here with all these, doing the work of 10 or 20 people. It's supposed to show modernization. It's supposed to show the future. And it's supposed to show the communists leading the party for all of the peasants, all the people here, to lead the way, to save everyone. And, of course, their big hero is Stalin up here at the top. This was part of the economic plan. Anything in here that basically sort of makes you think about war? Anything in here that makes you think about war? There's elements in this that are war. The people, the flag, the rows of the crops, him up at the top with a military hat on. And then you have to think about, was this an effective poster? If you were a typical poor peasant, which is most Soviets, and you saw this on your street corner, in your town, in your local community, at a local store, a shop, what do you think? Think you would have believed this? Now remember, this isn't just this. You're also going to hear this stuff. But they also controlled state media and propaganda. So in the news or movies, you're also going to hear this. Radio, you're going to hear this type of stuff. You have to wonder about that. Was this effective or not? I don't know. What do you think most poor people, most poor farmer peasants who had actually, a lot of them had their own farms for a while. They were sort of autonomous. They got to grow their own crops, feed their own families for a while, under Lenin at least. I don't know. What about reality? How much of this is real? In other words, the reality of the greater future. Do most peasants feel that or not? Are they in line with it? Think about collectivization. Think about their farms. Think about a lot of them are working in factories now. Is that better or worse? Think about the visual aspects of it. The fact that it's very monochrome. I mean, I guess you've got 4 colors here. Black, white, red, and the green. So I guess it's, I don't know, quadchrome. I don't even know. I'm just making that up. You got like 4 colors. Obviously, there's lots of other colors they could use. They purposely have a very simple, very basic. They want the red to stand out, of course. I don't know. What about the language? The writing? The majority of the Russian population was still illiterate. We talked about China. China was 80% illiterate in this time period. Russia was 50%. So at least half the population couldn't read. So, what does it mean? I don't know what the language is. I don't know what the language is, but like, what did it mean? You know, for all the people who couldn't read it, you know, think about all those things. Think about all the things, the colors and the idea of collectivization, pro or con, the sort of the military aspects of it, the flag and the colors. The color red, what's color red signify? Red usually talks either war or blood. Of course, it stands for the Communist Party. Stalin there in his military, the different rows, all the people lined up in the back, all the peasants back there, the idea of collectivization. A lot of them are now going in the factories. Think about all the different aspects of this, and think about if you were a poor peasant that had lost your farm, what would you think about it? Now, think about if you're loyal. Don't think about it from just our aspect of, oh, this is terrible, I lost everything, as we're looking at sort of after the fact, but think about it if you're a loyal communist. You're loyal to the government. You're loyal and you trust your government. A lot of people really did. There were no mass uprisings or revolts in this time period. There wasn't. I'm not saying there wasn't occasional things, of course, but there was no big mass uprising, no big revolt, no more revolution. How'd they keep that out of the way? How'd they keep that from happening? How many people were loyal? And bear in mind this. Everybody watched everybody. In these authoritarian governments, whether it's fascism or communism, everybody watched everyone. There was always a permanent sense of suspicion. Because people would just disappear. It happened all the time to be sent off to re-education. So you always had to be suspicious and be careful about what you said and where you said it and who you said it to, even your own family members, or if you were at a job. And so you had to be conscious about being loyal, both truly loyal internally, as some I'm sure were, but then you also had to portray loyalty. You had to evoke loyalty out in the public to people, whether you felt it or not. Because if someone thought you were disloyal, you were effed. You really were. Bad things happen to those that are disloyal to the party. And everybody was supposed to be loyal to the party. So, yeah. A lot of different things to think about in this type of image. Pictures speak 1,000 words. I'm sure I've said 1,000 words about it, so let's move on. Stalin's Soviet Union. Stalinist terror and the Great Purges. Old Lenin supporters, the old Bolsheviks, and pre-Russian Revolution Bolsheviks were now perceived as threats by Stalin. Basically, anyone who was a supporter of the old way under Lenin were a threat to Stalin. He began to purge them of these individuals. The secret police rounded up party officials, rounded up union officials, managers, intellectuals, army officers, and others. Millions were executed in show trials across the country. Millions. Largest recorded mass executions in world history. And the Romans did some pretty nefarious shit. Romans were known to have executed hundreds of thousands of people a few different times. But nothing like this. Millions in public execution trials. Yeah, nothing. Nowhere else in the world has anything been seen like this that's ever been done. We have these forced labor camps out in Siberia for enemies of the state. They were sent to these labor camps where most froze or starved to death, never to be seen again. Millions. These are not exaggerated numbers. We have lots and lots of hard evidence of records. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, we have tons and tons of evidence. There were millions of pages of documents that were revealed that became public knowledge. Yeah, these are not exaggerated numbers. I don't know if it's even in my notes somewhere, the number, but most people believe that by the end of Stalin's reign as the leader of the Soviet Party for almost 30 years, from the mid-20s to the early 50s, he was responsible for anywhere between 40 and 80 million of his own people being killed by his own hand, by his own rules, regulations, and policies, at his own direction. 40 to 80 million of his own people he had killed, or killed as a result of his policies, starvation, these 5-year plans, stuff like that, which actually puts him up there as the worst. That actually categorizes him as far as killing people and responsible for killing folks. It makes him directly responsible, number one on the list. No one in world history has ever been directly responsible for killing 80 million people. That would earn him a special place in wherever bad people go. Yeah. All right. Stalin, much like Maximilien Robespierre in France, the Reign of Terror in the 1790s, he found many who were willing to assist, many people who were willing to assist with the purges, the whole ideology, willing accomplices, many millions of willing accomplices. Why were they willing accomplices? There's lots of reasons. Many of them did buy directly into the ideology, the communist ideology of us versus them, and everyone else is basically evil and should be destroyed. Many were self-preservation. It's either you or me. 2 of us are here, 1 of us is walking out, the other one's going to die. Who's it going to be, you or me? So this idea of self-preservation, believing if I incriminate them and I have their family destroyed, then my family will be safe. That is until someone else chooses to do that to you. And of course, status. You eliminate people who are competition, or people who are above you, or people who might in any way denounce you, or stand against you, or resist you, or question your loyalty. So you get rid of all those people that elevate your status, your opportunity, elevate your family. And for many of them, it was a simple situation. If I get rid of you, that gives me another day of reprieve. One more day. The more I point my finger at someone else, that gives me more days. Maybe one day it will be me and my family. But the more I can basically kill other people or destroy other people's lives, that gives me more days of life to live. Almost like as a Soviet citizen, you realized from day one you were going to die an early, untimely death. It was just a matter of how many years could you get before you met that untimely early death. Yeah. You didn't die of natural causes of old age in the Soviet Union unless you were really, really lucky. Something was going to get you before old age did. Yeah. There are some, again, we do believe there's certainly some that truly believe. There's probably some that truly believed. They were brainwashed. They truly believed in the Soviet message. They really believed in the party message. But again, remember, the whole way, this was all groupthink and brainwashing and psychological propaganda. The Soviets did it, the Germans did it, the Italians to a much lesser degree, the Japanese did it, to basically convince much of the population that what they're doing is right. You should pull that trigger on that person because they're a bad person, you're a good person, get rid of them. That makes everyone better, or makes it better for the entire society. Brainwashed by rhetoric, brainwashed by media, constant bombardment from it. Well, let's talk about him. The roots of Nazism, the worst regime possibly to develop ever, as far as a whole regime. Maybe Stalin might have been the individually worst person, but as far as the catastrophe that is brought upon the world to other people, to outside other folks, we can look at this man, Hitler. As a young man, Hitler was exposed to Austria-Germany nationalism, extreme nationalism, who believed Germans were superior race, and Germans should be Europe's natural rulers. He embraced this extreme social Darwinism, anti-Semitism, the idea of survival of the fittest, survival of the white race, superior whites, Nordic ancestry, which I guess is thought of as like Northern European. Of course, anti-Semitic. Many people believed, and Hitler was one of these that followed this, that Jews were leading some type of international conspiracy to promote capitalism and socialism and to basically bring down German culture. Jews were this evil that were all conspiring to destroy this white master race. Of course, Jews were white, but that didn't seem to make a difference. These nationalists cultivated a belief in Hitler that inferior people should be expelled from the empire. Now, it wasn't about execution early on. Hitler's crusade against the other wasn't initially about killing them. It was initially about expulsion, getting rid of them, removing them from their territory, go somewhere else. That was initially what it was, the idea of superior versus inferior, the white master race. It wasn't about extermination initially. That comes a little bit later. He served in World War I. He was overjoyed at this prospect. Great War, overjoyed at the prospect of this German victory over Europe. Of course, he was devastated when Germany surrendered, and he blamed the loss on the Jews and socialism, which I've read about this a lot, and I've never really gotten a clear picture of what it was, how he somehow came to blame the Jews. I know that where he got the ideas from other nationalist social movements in Austria-Hungary from the early 1900s. So I get where he got that from, but I've never really been clear to me where they got it from. Jewish people have been persecuted all through history. A lot of it is entirely illogical, and it really doesn't make sense. Many places, Jews have been the outsiders. They've often been outsiders, having different culture, different language, and many different religious practices. Different, and because they're usually people from outside, they're not usually indigenous populations in many regions in Europe. Maybe it was simply that. They're different, they look different, and so they were targeted. And over the years, that became the most common target of, hey, the most different, it's always been them, it's always been the Jews, so let's just continue to focus on the Jews. They've always been the bad guys, they would say, so let's just keep focusing on them. But their actual factual basis for any of this anti-Semitism, it doesn't exist. I've never ever seen any type of rational, actual, factual basis for it. It doesn't exist. Just wrong place at the wrong time in much of European history. And unfortunately, it was catastrophic for the Jewish population as a result of that. After the war, Hitler joined extremist groups. He gained control, changed the group name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which later becomes known as the Nazi Party. He was incredibly charismatic. He inflamed his audience with these powerful speeches, crowds of thousands. He attacked the Versailles Treaty, saying the Versailles Treaty was terrible for Germany, which he was right about that, it was. Versailles Treaty was really bad. Some would say the Versailles Treaty was one of the leading causes of World War II. The terrible situation it put Germany into after World War I. Versailles Treaty was bad. But he attacked the Versailles Treaty, he talked terrible about the Jews, he talked about people profiting off of war, off of using German supplies and materials, that he said the Germans should be the only ones to profit off of that. He attacked the German Republic. In the 1920s and 30s, Germany was actually on its way to a democratic republic. Actually on its way to an actual democratic republic for a while. It was sort of getting there. And had the Depression not happened, it might have been successful. we might have actually gotten a sort of a quasi-democratic representative government in Germany, maybe. Then the Depression hit, and Germany, of course, crashed. It crashed harder than other industrial nations. There was, by the early 30s, Germany had almost 50% unemployment. Now, that was partially to the Depression and partially due to the Versailles Treaty, and so much damage economically, industrially that was done as a result of the treaty, which was really, really bad. All the reparations and all the land it took and all the resources it took from Germany. So you put all these things together, and it is a recipe for absolute disaster. He does actually have an uprising in the 20s. Mussolini actually takes over Italy in, 21, I'm going to say. I think it's around 21. Mussolini is a fascist dictator, manages to rise to power, many of the same kind of ideas in Italy, and manages to actually gain power and sort of take over Italy in the early 20s. Hitler believes he can do the same thing. He attempts to do it, and he is imprisoned, thrown in prison, and that's, of course, where he writes the Mein Kampf, My Struggle. He's in prison. But the Nazi Party survives. It doesn't go away. The Nazi Party survives, continues to prosper, grow, find recruits, find followers, becoming a national party, a national powerful party, political party, while Hitler's away. And when he gets out of prison, he takes right over again, and almost immediately, within a year, he's running the Nazi Party again. Then the Depression happens. The Depression happens, which pretty much opened the door to Hitler. The Depression devastated the German economy. He found this very useful in gaining support because he'd always been saying the Jews were bad, they were hurting the economy, he could now blame it on the Jews. He said the German democratic government was bad and was corrupt and going to destroy our economy. He can now say, look what they did. This really, the Depression was wonderful for Hitler, and it really was wonderful for the Nazi Party. It left them wide open for them to basically come in and say, we're going to solve everything, we're going to assume power. He started talking about this idea of a supreme leader for Germany, this idea of a Führer, and of course the living space. I don't have the German word on here, but living space equates to expansion of Germany. Initially, it was only to get back the land they lost. He was one of the things that made him so effective was his language was, even though it was strong and it was fiery, it was often thought to be very reasonable to a typical German. Let's get our land, but all we want is our land back that was taken from us. We want it for the white master race. We don't want to kill anyone else. We just want them to leave. We want them to go out of the country. We're not executing people. We're not doing the kind of crazy stuff like is happening in the Soviet Union. Everyone knew what was happening in the Soviet Union. We're not killing people. We're not imprisoning people. We simply want people to leave the country, to get out of the country. We want it for us. We want our land back. And we want to give everybody jobs and increase the economy. You could see where a lot of it was appealing. A lot of the stuff he was saying was generally reasonable stuff. A lot of the really crazy stuff, his whole master plan, a lot of the really crazy off-the-rails, world-dominating, execute everybody, that stuff comes years later. But a lot of his early stuff was logical to people, it made sense to people, and it was what folks wanted to hear, which is one of the reasons he was able to get away with it for so long and become so powerful. And he targeted the young people, the people who were very able to be, coerced more easily, perhaps, or convinced more easily. Concentrated his efforts on building the Nazi Party, focused on appealing to German youth, as almost half the country was unemployed, looking for answers anywhere. He provided them, promised salvation. In 1931, almost half of the Nazi Party were under the age of 30, so it was primarily young people that were joining the Nazi Party, promised salvation, promised them jobs, a future for themselves. Hitler gained support from key individuals in the army, and eventually the president himself, von Hindenburg, appointed him chancellor. Hitler had finally gained the power legally and became basically the head of the most powerful political party, leader of the Nazis, and he then almost immediately bans all of the political parties, meaning there was only one political party, just the Nazi Socialist Party, to run everything. and he is the chancellor, has absolute power to save the country from the Depression and to protect it from all of the outsiders, all the others. The Nazi state and society. I'm going to go through this stuff a little quicker. Feel free to pause and take notes of what you need to do. His rise to power was really fast. First, he passed the Enabling Act, which enabled him, which gave, it basically went through the legislature almost immediately because the legislature is now comprised mostly of Nazi Party members. Gave him absolute dictatorial powers. He says he was going to help them recover from the Depression. That was what the powers were for, to recover from the Depression, which he actually does. He's very successful in that. He brings Germany right out of the Depression in just a couple years. The president was probably senile, by this point in time. He allowed Hitler to do anything he wanted. And by 1934, he had total, absolute control of the German government. And his party had total and absolute control of the German political system. By 34, 35, the Nazis had total control of Germany. All under Hitler. It happened amazingly fast. Surprised the world how quickly it happened. He immediately began to reshape the government. He outlawed strikes, he outlawed unions, he outlawed anyone writing books or any type of literature that wasn't directly approved by the Nazi Party. All publishers, universities, all media, written media, movie media, audio media, all of it was put under control of the Nazi Party. Anything and everything that could convince people or talk to people or write about or talk about or speak about anything came under the control of the Nazis. They controlled every single thing you heard, you thought, you read, you wrote, you watched. All of it was a very unified Nazi message. Burned books, destroyed anyone who spoke out against them, people who were liquidated, disappeared. The SS were his personal secret police, personal guard. Even longtime Nazi supporters. Doesn't matter who you were. You ever spoke out against Hitler or the Nazi Party or what they were doing, you were gone. Jews were targeted with the Nuremberg laws in 1935. They were identified and targeted. They were given all kinds of constraints on the Jews. These are German Jews. These are German citizens. But they're not the right kind of German citizens. They're Jews. They found themselves to have their citizenship statuses revoked. They basically became non-citizens. Their businesses were taken away. Licenses were taken away. They weren't allowed to go to school. They weren't allowed to basically do anything that in any way could give them any type of power or financial power. They lost licenses. They weren't allowed to get to vote. Anything like that. These are all these Nuremberg laws. They basically became non-citizens in their own country. Kristallnacht demonstrated to the Jews the level of German brutality as Jews all across the nation were attacked. Neighborhoods and churches burned. Thousands hauled off to concentration camps in one single night. The night of broken glass. Kristallnacht. Broken glass. This was an organized plan that had been, been planned and orchestrated over at least the previous 18 months to basically target all the prominent Jewish communities, to arrest, burn, kill, execute, haul off to prison camps. And again, this was only a portion of the Jewish population, but it was anywhere where they were most outspoken of the Nazi government, or outspoken of Hitler, or most resistant. Usually, they targeted the people who had owned businesses, the most financial status, the most educated. They had lists, thousands of names. They knew exactly who they were going after. Basically, anyone that had any type of authority, education, status, wealth, targeted. It was a targeted hit list to take out anyone who had any type of power or status in the Jewish community, them and their families. Hitler only became more popular. His version of FDR's New Deal, all kinds of public work programs, public work projects, jobs, highways, offices, stadiums. The 1938 unemployment was basically zero. He eliminated the Depression. He made Germany the most powerful economic nation on the planet. We see greater equality, more opportunity, a rising middle class, better incomes, greater prosperity, everything. Among the chosen, the German non-Jewish populations, the white German, the white-haired, blue-eyed, those that were believed of Nordic descent, they basically enjoyed unprecedented status, success, leisure time, wealth, access to goods, more opportunities. Life was good if you were a typical German citizen, non-Jew. It was probably the best, most satisfying social life on the planet. So many people bought into the system entirely. They said, look around. He's fixed everything. He's done everything. Life is great. Life is wonderful. Our kids are in school. We have leisure activities. We go to the park. We have new vehicles. We have a nice home. We have good income. We have good food. And Hitler did all this. And he did, actually. He brought the country out. But he did it through this process of destroying everyone else, of eliminating anyone who was seen as undesirable, who was not one of the important people, any counter-religious groups, anyone who was socialist, any military officials that ever spoke out, Jewish people, of course, gays, homosexuals would be taken to prison camps, of course, the Jews, Catholics were attacked, even Protestants would be attacked. This wasn't about religion. That's an interesting thing, too. This really wasn't about religion. Yes, most German citizens would have been considered Protestant Christian, but Hitler's ideology wasn't really religious. Not really. Catholic people often spoke out against what he was doing. Christians often spoke out against what he was doing. This wasn't about religion. We see religious people speak out all the time, religious leaders. Some, of course, did not. Some completely towed the Hitler Nazi line. But those that did speak up because of the terrible things that were being done, the innocents that were being killed, etc., the minorities being targeted, they themselves would find their churches destroyed or burned, or they themselves hauled off to prison camps or concentration camps. People plotted against him. There were multiple plots to try and assassinate Hitler. All unsuccessful. These were his own people trying to kill him. All unsuccessful. Aggression and appeasement. Now we're moving into the war. From 33 to 39, Hitler declared the Treaty of Versailles void, null and void, meaning we're not going to follow it. We're not going to obey the treaty any longer. We don't care about that. Basically, he allowed him to start, because the Treaty of Versailles said he couldn't arm the nation. You couldn't build up military power. He decides to do it anyway. He rearms the nation. He starts aggressive tactics towards his neighbors. He defies the Treaty of Versailles. He marches into the Rhineland, which had been part of Germany at one point. It's basically sort of a territory between Germany and France, this idea of Rhineland. He marches into it, a contested territory. The French did not go to war at the time, even though really it was an invasion of France, because the Rhineland was controlled and France claimed it. France didn't attack, though. They didn't declare war because England didn't want to. England was scared shitless about going into another war. Last thing they wanted was another war. They were still dealing with the Depression. It was still catastrophic to their nation. They didn't want another war. This is what's called appeasement, basically giving in to Germany to avoid a war. The irony is, many people say the appeasement, giving in to Germany for so many years, actually led to war and made the war worse, because it allowed Germany to build up and get very, very powerful before the war finally starts. Hitler supported Mussolini's attack. Mussolini actually attacks into Ethiopia. 37, I'm going to say. Somewhere around 37. Mussolini invades Ethiopia, claiming Ethiopia is a lost Christian nation, and invades, and eventually signs a treaty, an alliance with Italy. This agreement creates what's known as the Rome-Berlin Axis, 1936, which, shortly afterwards, Japan joined it. And then the Rome-Berlin Axis becomes known as the Axis Alliance. of these three fascist totalitarian dictatorship states: Japan, Italy, and Germany. Austria was next. The Nazis invade Austria, which now allows them another new province, a new territory, which is now controlled. It's now, Hitler starts calling it Greater Germany now. It's no longer Germany, it starts being known as Greater Germany, because it now has multiple provinces. The Rhineland, it has Austria, it starts taking other territories, moving into other regions, and starts claiming these. They're now part of Germany. Historically, on a map, these all might have been part of a German empire centuries ago. Some of it might have even been before World War I. But, of course, Europe's map's been rewritten 100 times since then, nonetheless. The next region he looks at is Sudetenland. He demands that German-speaking pro-Nazi Sudetenland, which is part of Western Czechoslovakia, he says it has to be handed over to the German government. British Prime Minister Chamberlain, he actually meets with the German officials. He negotiates an annexation, might be the best way to put it. He negotiates an agreement that Germany can annex Sudetenland, which is actually part of Czechoslovakia, without Czechoslovakia's approval. Now, Chamberlain then comes back. He comes back to Europe. He gets off a plane. He actually waves the paperwork in the air. It's really funny. It's not funny. It's not funny, haha. It's funny as in weird and sad and crazy. He actually gets off the plane and waves the paper in the air and says, "I have achieved peace in our time." Because what the Germans agreed to was no more land. They agreed they would not take any more land, no more annexations. They said, now we have Sudetenland, we have this land in Austria, we have this, the Rhineland, we have all this territory, he says, or the Germans say, we're done. We've expanded, we've gotten back all what should actually be German land, we're now happy with the new Greater Germany. And they signed this treaty agreeing to take no more land. And Chamberlain says, I did it. We're done. We've given them stuff. We've given all the stuff. There's not going to be war. Yeah. Right. Almost immediately, within months, he then invades and takes over the rest of Czechoslovakia. Continues invading. Continues taking over. He then moves his tanks and war apparatus to the border of Poland, which Poland had been part of Hungary before. And England and France both declare, or they threaten war. They threaten, if you invade Poland, that's an act of war. We cannot give you any more land. You've taken all this. If you continue to do it, you will be basically instigating war. Hitler then does this. The Germans sign a non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union, which means very clearly to the rest of the world, everyone who knows anything looks at it and says, okay, that's war. The big problem Germany had in World War I was they had to fight a two-war front for most of the war between the French and the Soviets, or the French and the Russians. Now they're not going to have a two-front war. They've got a non-aggression treaty with the Russians. They've taken over most of Eastern Europe already. Everyone knows what the next step is going to be. No longer really concerns, Hitler no longer cares what anyone else wants. He invades Poland on September 1st, 1939, full-on invasion. This does finally force England and France to declare war, and on November 3rd, England and France jointly declare war on Germany. The first invasions the Germans really did was 36, 3 years earlier, over 3 years, and they started their build-up all the way back in 34, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. It could very easily be said, had we attacked Germany years earlier, the World War would have been a lot worse. But the thing is, no one wanted to be the bad guy. No one wanted to instigate and start World War II. No one wanted to attack Germany and start the war. So they gave in and gave in and gave in the appeasement. In this appeasement process, only emboldened the Germans, emboldened the Nazis and Hitler, believing, oh, they're not going to stop us, we're just going to keep going and going. And then they had 6 years to basically build up what became the most powerful military on the world, uncontested. And then when it became apparent Hitler was just going to keep invading territories and wasn't going to stop, they had to declare war. Wasn't any choice. Germany in 1933, we see remilitarized area taking over the Rhineland, Sudetenland, invasion of Austria, annexation. Annexation is a polite way of saying basically conquering. They conquered. Invading Poland, conquering Poland in September. And then we have this territory here, annexed by Soviet Union, September, as part of the peace treaty, giving them this land and territory. Pretty crazy. And in just a couple of years, Germany basically controls most of northeastern Europe, with a non-aggression treaty with the Soviets, and a lot of neutral nations around, and with an alliance with Italy. Really, the only thing they have standing against them is France. That's it. That's all that's left. France and Belgium is not really an issue. England, but England is off the coast. That's the only thing that saved England, was the fact that the Germans couldn't get to them with their tanks. The Blitzkrieg couldn't reach them. The Germans' lightning war. The first step was conquest. Wrong button. There we go. That's the button I was looking for. Let's see. The German Blitzkrieg allowed the Nazis to swiftly move into territory and crush any opposing forces. The Lightning War used planes, tanks, trucks to conquer Poland in 4 weeks. They conquered the entire country in less than a month. It was hell on wheels, fast-moving death. Yeah. The Nazis swarmed into France through Belgium. France was unprepared for the speed of the attack. The French government accepted defeat immediately. A new government was established, known as the Vichy, which was later called Vichy France. Pétain was a French general, Henri Philippe Pétain. He unexpectedly collaborated with the Nazis over the course of the Nazi collaboration. Basically, Vichy France became an extension of Nazi Germany. There was a French resistance. Part of France did resist, but generally the country was in Nazi hands and was considered Nazi-controlled territory for most of the war. So in 1940, all of Europe was either under German control, allied with Germany, or non-aggression treaty in the case of a couple of countries. The big one, the significant one being the Soviet Union. The only reason England wasn't overrun by the Soviets, they would have been overrun as well, because the Germans, because the Germans couldn't get there. They just simply couldn't get there. They bombed it. England underwent a continuous bombing campaign from the Germans for years. And the English did the same thing back to the Germans, bombed Germany for years. This is the Battle of Britain, the air campaign we're talking about. From France, Hitler launched air attacks on Britain, known as the Battle of Britain. Hitler began bombing British cities, hoping to break the British morale, hitting the cities, military bases, anywhere they can, destroying British ships. Eventually, the German Air Force was defeated, and by 1942, England basically controlled the skies over much of Western Europe, certainly along the water. The invasion couldn't happen if he couldn't control the skies. The Blitzkrieg required control of land and air. And England managed to stop that. Therefore, any ships that would have come over would have been destroyed by the British airplanes, destroyed by the British weapon emplacements. Therefore, to try and transport his army across the water to get to England would have been a suicide. Most of his forces would have been destroyed in the process. He would have lost big part of his army trying to do it. So he gave up for a full-on invasion of England. That was the plan initially in 1940. But by 1941, it became apparent a full invasion of England probably wasn't going to happen. and they generally shift their focus south, more towards Asia and into Africa. We do see the breaking of the treaty, the non-aggression treaty with the Soviets. He invades the Soviet Union. German forces quickly surround the city of Leningrad. They actually made it all the way to Moscow. They took control of Ukraine. Eventually, the Soviet winter does stop them. It does stop them. You can't fight a war against the Soviets in the wintertime. You really can't. And they eventually bog down as they sort of cross into what we would think of as Asia proper. They start to cross into Asia part of the Soviet Union. And they don't ever really get much further. We sort of see a stalemate line form in Eastern Europe, similar to sort of kind of what we saw in World War I. This whole, where the Germans and the Soviets basically form this line along the western part of the Soviet Union, and they spend several years shooting at each other, killing each other, capturing groups, imprisoning. There's Soviet prison camps with Germans, German prison camps with Soviets. Big part of the death toll in the war was actually Soviets being killed in German prison camps, or starved to death, or frozen to death. Potentially millions. Potentially 1 to 2 million at least, if not. I've actually seen numbers, several million Soviets have basically died as German prisoners of war. The Nazis' New Order began to take form in Europe. It was based on racial imperialism, placed the Nordic, Scandinavian peoples right below the German peoples, Germans at the top, Nords were next, the French were the next, and then Latins were below that, inferior Latins, sort of seen as a middle race. We have the subhuman Slavic peoples, which are mostly Eastern European, Balkans region folks. A lot of Russian folks would have probably been under that category of Slavic folks. Jews, Polish. And in 1942, the exterminations begin. I've never seen whether it was clear this was Hitler's plan all along, like going all the way back to 1935 when he's giving all the speeches about the others and how the Jews need to be expelled and the others and the minorities need to be expelled from Germany. I don't know if his plan all along was to execute all of them. Nonetheless, by 1941-42, this master plan comes into fruition, where he does start forming extermination camps, execution camps, prison camps, but the prison camps were basically working people to death. Let's get an idea of France, occupied by Germany, annexed by Germany, basically under the control of Germany, or this Vichy France becomes basically an ally of Germany. This is occupied at the top, and then the southern part becomes an alliance, working with the Germans. Collaborators is what they called them. And in France, if you were captured as a collaborator with the Germans, you would be executed instantly. That was grounds for immediate execution if you were a German collaborator. The Holocaust. Early in the war, German officials wanted the unwanted populations pushed out, exported, removed from the country. That was the policy initially. They many times put them in these ghettos, these urban ghettos on the periphery of the Germany. They basically would put them in these city districts and force them all to live there. Then they started shipping them off to Poland, believing they're going to use Poland as basically a place to use as a mass prison camp to get rid of all of the Jews. Anywhere that the Germans occupied, they expelled Jewish populations or any of those inferior populations that we saw on the previous slide. Any of the undesirable inferiors, they would expel initially. Again, initially it wasn't executions. Up until 1941, there wasn't really executions. I'm sure people died, of course. There were incidents and situations and times where folks were killed, of course, or people simply died of starvation or mistreatment or freezing, etc. But as far as a concerted effort to just kill everyone, that doesn't really seem to come about till 1941-1942. What caused that change, I'm not exactly sure. The best rationale I've heard is because Hitler comes to believe he's going to try and conquer the world. If they're going to conquer the world, there's no place to expel the others. After all, you're going to control everything. So therefore, the only rational thing to do, if you're going to conquer everything, you can't get rid of them. You keep pushing them out. So the only rational thing to do is to kill everyone. At least in Hitler's mind. From 1941 to 1945, we see real extermination. You can't really ship them off anymore, so let's simply kill all of them. Mass executions of Jews and others, and Russians as well, by the way. Millions of Russians were killed in prison camps as well, executed. Hitler and Nazi leadership orders this final solution plan to the Jewish problem. Jews were packed into trains, shipped to extermination camps. Some were in slave labor camps as well, but they often died there too of malnutrition, starvation, mistreatment, freezing. Often happened. By the end of the war, as many as 6 million Jews were executed, killed, died, and potentially as many as 6 million Russians. A lot of those are Russian Jews that were executed, but millions of those were prisoners of war, Russian soldiers that were captured and then killed. Either killed, executed, or simply left. Locked into prison camps, not given food, supplies, or clothes, and they just froze to death, starved to death. Yeah. I don't know, what do you say? It's, Yeah. As far as actual people killed in the war, directly killed in the war, about half killed as a result of this Holocaust. About half were killed in prison extermination camps. About half died on the battlefield, and about half died in these exterminations, or these, I don't know exactly, it's not extermination exactly when they're left in a prison camp or they're left to freeze to death, but it's effectively the same thing. It's a distinction within a difference, maybe, really. But yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about Japan a little bit. Japan's racial hatred certainly existed in Asia. We've already talked about that. The Japanese military invaded China. They maintained a policy of kill all, burn all, destroy all. That's an official policy of the Japanese government. Kill all, burn all, destroy all. Millions of Chinese were killed in these wars, these invasions of China from the Japanese. As many as 4 million killed. Millions of other casualties, many imprisoned, many put on forced slave labor working in factories and industrial mines, things like that. After Japan joined the German alliance, it was given permission to use southern Indochina, because southern Indochina, basically what we think of as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all that entire southeastern corner of the Asian continent was French colonies. And therefore Vichy France is now an ally of Germany, so they give them permission to use all that territory as they want. It basically becomes de facto German alliance. They become basically de facto. And of course, that allows Japanese to basically invade. Japanese invade, they move in, there's invasion of Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, there's an invasion plan for Australia. This is nothing less. The Axis alliance of Italy, Germany, and Japan had nothing less. Their goal was nothing less than to conquer the world. Simple. That was their ultimate goal, to conquer the entire planet. They had plans designed to invade the rest of China, to invade into India, to invade Australia. They were already moving into conquering Southeast Asia. The Italians and the Germans are moving in northern Africa. By 42, 43, the Italians and Germans are conquering parts of northern Africa. It was a global invasion of these three countries to basically conquer the world. Well, the oil thing came along. America had tried negotiating and tried negotiating with the Japanese all the way into 40, 41. Even at the time of Pearl Harbor, which I'm about to talk about, the Japanese were still actively negotiating with us. We know that the negotiations were false. We know after the fact that the negotiations were basically a ruse. They were a smokescreen to throw us off, to not make us think that they were actually going to invade and attack us. They wanted us to think they were still negotiating with us. Well, all the way through 39, 40 into 41, we kept negotiating, and the more they invaded China, the more they supported Germany, invasions into Indochina. We eventually told them we have to cut off the oil to them. We did cut off their oil. We cut off their oil, ultimately by 40, we had cut off about 85% of the entire oil supply to Japan. Through either our own exports we cut off, and then also because the American Navy controlled much of the Pacific, so we basically were cutting off trade routes to them. So we basically cut their oil off. In the 1940s, you could not wage war without oil. You simply couldn't. Tanks, planes, bombs, ships, all of it needed petroleum. So you simply could not wage war without a sufficient and steady oil supply. You couldn't. And Japan realized by 1940 they had a year, maybe 18 months of oil left. And so by 42, they would be running out of oil. And boom, there you go. So, yeah. Japan comes up with their version of, let's not use master plan because that refers to the German master plan, but they come up with this plan that they are basically going to take over the Pacific, all of it. They're going to take it from America and our military and our Navy and the Marines. They're going to take it over, therefore reconnecting the oil supplies. Not necessarily taking America's oil, because a lot of the oil didn't come from us, because basically we were cutting off their oil supply, but that doesn't mean it was all coming from us. We were cutting off the trade routes. They're going to reestablish the trade routes, reconnect and establish their oil supply through Southeast Asia, around Africa, and up into the I've totally gone blank. Up until the North Pacific Ocean. But to do that, they have to neutralize the American naval power, which they do. Temporarily, they do indeed do this. They felt that war was inevitable. They lied to us for a long period of time, pretending to negotiate with us. Because remember, Japan had been our ally. All through the early 1900s, they've been an ally of others. So we had negotiations with them, and so we thought we were going to be able to work something out. For a long time, they'd already known they weren't going to do that. They had to have the oil, so they had to cripple us. They launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, early hours. I think it was a Sunday morning. The very next day, or later that day, I forget which it was, but almost immediately, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our president, serving his, at this point would be his... Technically, it's the end of his second term, but he's about to be inaugurated for his third term. He just won re-election in November for his third term as president. It was legal back then to have more than 2 terms. And he declares war, as he says, the day, referring to December 7th, the day which will live in infamy. And the U.S. immediately declares war on Japan after this. Half of our naval fleet was destroyed at the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. But about half of our fleet was out on maneuvers. So, only about half the fleet was actually destroyed. It was a terrible day, the worst attack on American soil prior to 9/11. About 2,500 Americans died in that attack. Soldiers, civilians, nurses, Navy men. It was terrible. But just a matter of hours, 2,500 American lives lost. A dozen ships damaged or sunk, and of course much of Pearl Harbor in ruins. Airfields destroyed, towns destroyed, buildings burned, exploded. It was a devastating attack. that we really didn't know was coming. We had intelligence telling us they were doing something, but it was really iffy. It was our decoding wasn't really. We hadn't really cracked the Japanese code yet, so we weren't entirely sure what was happening. We knew something was imminent, but they didn't know where. At the time, we thought we couldn't be attacked at Pearl Harbor because it was too far. And it actually was. A lot of the planes that attacked were kamikaze. They were one-way trips. They ran out of fuel. They often used the planes themselves as bombs into ships to actually do a lot of catastrophic damage. It was a one-way trip for those Japanese pilots. They knew they weren't going back. But they were able to reach Pearl Harbor, even though we didn't really think they could. They had aircraft carriers. They were the first aircraft carriers. Japanese, we immediately copied what they did and had our own aircraft carriers almost immediately. But the Japanese built the first aircraft carriers, which allowed them to reach us. The Japanese were extremely cruel towards prisoners of war, civilians under occupation. Wounded prisoners were murdered, nurses were raped, hundreds of thousands of Korean women as forced sexual slaves. The Koreans were seen as an inferior race. Basically, the entire Korean population was used as forced labor, slaves, sex slaves, the women. Exactly the kind of racial hierarchy the Germans had in Europe. A whole racial hierarchy of Germans and all the inferior races. Japanese had the same thing. And Koreans ranked down towards the bottom. They were an inferior Asian race. Very similar racial ideologies of the Germans, only focused on Asian populations. As I said, millions of Chinese were killed by the Japanese during the war, both before the war, dating all the way back to the invasions in the 20s and 30s. By 1943, almost half of China was controlled, occupied by the Japanese. Axis powers, those are the bad guys. Occupied by Germany and its allies. Extermination camps, the Black Squares, concentration camps, mass killings. Germans had a lot of creative ways. They would sometimes bring some of these ghettos where they had been shipping the Jews for years to these ghettos. Sometimes they found it more efficient they created execution or extermination buses. They would drive the buses into the neighborhoods. They would load them up with 40 or 50 people, seal the bus, and just gas them right there in the bus, kill them all, dump them out on the sidewalk, and then drive down to the next neighborhood and do it again. It was a quickest, most efficient way to kill as many Jews as possible before the war ended. Especially once 44 came around and the Germans started to realize they might not actually win. They ramped up their exterminations and actually killed more and more people to try and kill as many as possible, just in case the war didn't go the way they anticipated. The Grand Alliance, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Churchill, Prime Minister of England, Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, enemy of my friend again. Remember, Stalin's a really bad guy, but he was an enemy of the Germans. He was willing to ally with us. We had a common enemy. So therefore we formed an alliance with Stalin, who he himself was an evil man. But the Soviets had the largest military in the world. Not the most powerful. But there was a belief that at one point the Soviets may have had as many as 20 million men in uniform. They had a huge population. They already had a population of 150, 180 million or something like that. They were a huge population. At one point, they might have had close to 20 million in uniform. Biggest military as far as soldiers on the planet. So we needed their military. We needed their might. They did have a lot of industrial capacity. Even the lands that Germany took from Soviet Union, most of the Soviet Union was still untouched. Matter of fact, by the time the war ended, the Soviets probably had a military just as powerful as the U.S., or close, and equal to the Germans. It's very clear that by the time the war ended, the Soviets might have been able to single-handedly defeat the Germans. Maybe. Nonetheless, they were very powerful, so we needed their power. We needed their assistance. Churchill succeeds Neville Chamberlain. He becomes a prime minister. Roosevelt, of course, is the president of the U.S. Now, Roosevelt and Churchill were decidedly anti-communist. They hated communism. They hated the Soviet Union. They knew Stalin was bad. It didn't matter. They needed him. They needed him as an ally. The strategy of the Grand Alliance was to defeat Hitler first, then launch an all-out strike on Japan. This was a Europe-first policy. Defeat the Germans, then worry about the Japanese. German industry was no match for the strong industries of England, the U.S., and the Soviet Union. Individually, Germany was equal to any, but basically the three powerful industrial nations, remember the U.S. and England had been industrialized long before Germany, and had had many, many years to build up basically without any real outsourcing. Really, the English had primarily just been building a military capacity and just basically holding off the Germans with their Air Force. The Royal Air Force had to be commended. They basically held off the Germans single-handedly for years. And they took a huge toll. Many Air Force pilots died. Just stopping the Germans, British Air Force, and there were some Americans that fought as part of the Royal Air Force as well. But this allowed Germans' industrial capacity, which had been well grounded and established for centuries. And of course, most of Russia was still untouched. Even though the Germans had invaded Western Soviet Union, the majority of the country was still left free to produce and build factories and build machines of war. And of course, the United States was completely untouched. What happened in Pearl Harbor as far as influencing our military industrial capacity was negligible. If anything, it only inspired us to build more and faster. The Allied economies were far superior to the German economy. They got started slower. The Germans had a big head start, and that's why the Germans had such success for the first couple of years. But by 1942, 43, 44, the other three powers, England, America, and Russia, caught up and then surpassed Germany. By 1943, the U.S. outproduced the entire world combined in industrial output. The whole world. By 1943-44, our GDP, our gross domestic product of produced goods, this included civilian and military goods, was greater than the whole rest of the world combined. We alone would have been able to defeat the Germans by ourselves once we finally got into the war in 44, and the Japanese. But the Soviets probably could have done it too. Probably. The war in Europe, 42 to 45. Germany defeats the Soviet Union, or the Germany's success against the Soviet Union in 43 was largely due to the... I will back all it up. Let's back that up for a second. I'm not going to cut it. We'll just keep going. We'll go with the flow. Germany's defeat by the Soviet Union was probably due to the fact that the strong Soviet military, the harsh Soviet winter, at the beginning of the Soviet and German engagements in 43, the Germans probably had close to 500,000 soldiers in Eastern Europe fighting the Soviets. But 1944, half of them had already surrendered to the Red Army or been killed. By 1944, the Soviets were winning. By 1944, the Soviets had retaken almost all the territory the Germans had taken from them, and they were on the move, pushing into Germany. The Soviets simply had more soldiers. The Soviets had 5 or 6 soldiers for every 1 German soldier. The Germans had superiority in technology, and they had more tanks, more planes. But the Russians basically had unlimited soldiers. For every soldier that died, they could replace him with 2 more. And we had already shown, under Stalin, the life of individual people was really insignificant. Individual soldiers' lives didn't really mean anything to the Communist Party. You were simply to be used to the greater good, the greater need. The Western Allies began to counter the Germans in Northern Africa. We see war fighting in the Middle East with the British and Americans defeating the Germans in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, Egypt. The colonies. This is really interesting. Really, by 43, a big part of the fighting in the world moved to the colonies. We start seeing the fighting in the colonial regions of the Germans, Italians, and the Japanese versus the American, British, and Soviet troops around the world. the war in Europe had largely drawn to a stalemate. Other than the Soviets and Germans in the East, where there was still some movement there, but much of the rest of Europe was basically sort of frozen. It wasn't really a lot happening there. 1943, Allied forces invaded southern Italy. The Italians quickly deposed Mussolini, accepted unconditional surrender. By 1944, we thought we had conquered Italy. Unfortunately, Mussolini was captured, imprisoned, and the Mussolinis managed to be freed by the Germans. Funny, it's sort of like what they did with Lenin back in World War I. They freed Lenin, sent him back to Soviet Union. Basically, it collapsed Russia, the Soviet Union, pulled him out of the war. The Germans managed to free Mussolini, and they put him back into control of Italy. And Italy renews its power, renews fighting. And the war, even though Italy had officially surrendered in 1943, the war ends up continuing on Italy for 2 more years with Mussolini back in power. Eventually, Mussolini is again captured, and this time they kill him. They don't let there be a three-peat, a repeat of Mussolini escaping and taking power again. So, 3rd time's the charm. When they capture him the 3rd time, they execute him. It ended up meaning war in Italy going on for almost 2 years longer, because Mussolini managed to retake power after the Germans got him out. The United States and England finally have the long-awaited invasion known as D-Day, which, by the way, if you look that up, it's very interesting. No one exactly knows what D-Day stands for. There's not an official what D stands for. It's really interesting. There's a lot of controversy about what it stands for. We know what the effect is. It's the invasion. It's the big invasion of Northern Europe, basically invasion into France, to start to liberate and free France and push back the Germans. The invasion actually takes place on about 7 different beaches. Normandy is one of the biggest one, but there's all kinds of beaches, about 7 different beaches. This invasion happens. There's so many war movies about World War II. There's just so many. You could watch so many things. Within a matter of weeks, we put over 2 million soldiers into Northern Europe. We had, by the end of World War II, in the United States alone, we had about 15 million soldiers in uniform by 1945. Now, this is all branches. These are Army. There's no actually Air Force yet, but there's Army, there's Navy, there's Marines, all of them in uniform. Altogether, close to 15 million. Primarily men, some women. We alone by 1944 could have conquered Germany all by ourselves. But the invasion begins with us getting about 2 million soldiers into Northern Europe within the first few weeks, here in June, July, and August of 44. Even by August, by August, we capture Paris. By the winter, we are starting to move into Germany, but we have to stop. It's really tough to fight wars in Europe in the winter. It's so wet, snow, ice, everything turns to mud. Basically, war has to sort of come to a pause in the winter in Europe. It's really difficult to fight because of the cold, the extreme temperatures. There's a lot of mountainous regions. Everything turns to mud and snow. So, yeah. Right on the edge of Germany, the invasion has to pause in the winter. It immediately restarts in the spring, and by March, we're breaking through Germany, into Germany. The Soviets are doing the same thing on the east. At the same time, the American allied forces of England and France and the United States are basically rushing through Western Europe, moving into Germany, crushing the German forces with all the fresh American troops, very similar to World War I. And all of our tanks and planes and bombs and supplies. The Soviets are doing the same thing on the east. Germany redirects all of its efforts against us towards the west when the massive invasion occurs and they realize it's happening and they can't stop it. Leaves the east open and the Russians come flying in. And basically they're pushing in on the east as quickly as we're pushing in on the west. By the beginning of March, April, we're moving into Berlin. By the end of April, Berlin is entirely surrounded, the capital of Germany. And make sure you get this right here. Hitler commits suicide basically on around April 30th. Around April 30th, Hitler commits suicide, him and his mistress, I think both. And in his bunker, he disappeared. They discover him later, whatever, committed suicide in his bunker. And then the German High Command, the Nazi German High Command, surrenders a week later on May 7th. It's really interesting. By the end of the war, the biggest concern of the Allies, and in this case by Allies I mean England and America, is that the Soviets are going to win the war. We're all allies, right? Soviets are allies. Really, we're not. Again, we're allies during the war because we have to be. But truthfully, we were hated and feared the communists and the Soviets and their power because they built a powerful military war machine. And so we were really more concerned that the Soviets were going to take Berlin and capture Hitler and thereby be able to claim that they won the war. So the rush against the clock in April and May wasn't actually against the Germans. It was a given. We'd already beaten them. It was just a matter of getting them to surrender. Germany was defeated. That was a given by the winter of 44. It was over. It was just a matter of getting in there and actually getting the Germans to, give up. We wanted to make sure that we beat the Soviets and got to Berlin first and were able to claim victory first. That was the biggest concern. Because we already knew by this time period who the next big enemy was going to be. We already knew it was going to be the Soviets. That was apparent to anybody from the West, that those were the big enemy on the horizon. Hitler's suicide around the 30th of April and the surrender a week later. Take a moment here to look at the map. You can see the map here. World War II in Europe, Africa, 39 to 45. Axis powers, Allied powers. Territories occupied. I'm not going to go over this. You can have a look at it. You can freeze it and look at it if you'd like. War in the Pacific, basically the U.S. versus Japan. Japan was really surprised. December 7th, 1941. But by mid-1942, we had already started to retake islands and territories. We'd already rebuilt our fleet. By 1943, we had a bigger fleet than the Japanese. Matter of fact, by 1944, we were finishing 3 ships a week in U.S. shipyards. That doesn't mean we were building a ship in, a week, but we had so many ships building, we had so many dozens and dozens of ships building simultaneously, that we were producing 3 military ships, rolling them off the shipyards every single week by 1944. By 45, we had the largest Navy in the world. Hands down. It didn't take us long to start basically taking back everything the Japanese had and taking back things they took from us. And yeah. Battle of Midway was a very important battle. We sank all 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers. This was primarily an aerial battle, which is interesting. It's a battle at sea, but it primarily was fought from the planes. The planes did most of the work. This was basically an aerial battle at sea off of aircraft carriers. By 43, we had equality with the Japanese fleet. Japan attempted to invade into Australia. We get the battles down there. Australian forces, American forces, one island at a time. The difficulty wasn't destroying Japan's Navy. It really wasn't. Japan's Navy went down pretty fast, actually. The problem was their soldiers. They had taken all these islands. They had dug in the islands. They had built caves in the islands, underground emplacements. The Navy came along and secured the island perimeter, but then the Marines had to actually go in and fight hand-to-hand combat, one-on-one combat, to basically clear out the Japanese from every one of these islands. It was fierce. It was brutal, violent. The Japanese had committed atrocities in China and the Philippines. Unfortunately, that meant the U.S. soldiers often committed atrocities right back upon them. We often executed Japanese POWs. The knowledge and the news about all the atrocities the Japanese have been doing now for well over a decade on the Chinese citizens, including Americans, Christians, Filipinos, which Philippines was an American territory, had American soldiers there. the ways American soldiers had been executed. Philippines alone, as many as 50,000 American soldiers were killed or executed by the Japanese. I would assume those were primarily Marines, I would think. Marines and sailors. Every time we took landed territory from the Japanese, the Americans often did the same thing back to them, executing people who'd surrendered. Yeah, lots of atrocities, lots of violence. War makes people do terrible things. The United States destroyed the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is still considered to be the largest naval battle in world history. Largest naval battle in world history, lasted a couple of days, spanned an area the size, I forget what I remember reading, I don't have it in my notes, but if I remember reading, the entire battle actually spanned a region of the ocean, something like the size of France. Like a massive region, like the size of an entire large country. It's a battle that lasted several days among multiple fleets, American fleets, British fleets, Australian fleets, Indian fleets, Japanese fleets. It was primarily America versus Japan. And of course, many, many planes and ships, the largest naval battle ever. And we destroyed almost the entire Japanese fleet. It was basically the end of Japan's naval power in the Pacific. Japan refused to surrender, though. Just refused to surrender. We had Iwo Jima, Okinawa in 1945, hundreds of thousands of casualties on 2 islands. The thing is, you understand, every single island had to be taken by the Marines. Once the ships destroyed the fleets, the Marines had to go on and fight hand-to-hand combat, town by town, city by city, area by area. Yeah. Okay. No surrender. And comes in the bombs. The United States started this process, which was known as the Manhattan Project. It started when a nuclear reaction happened in a lab at the University of Chicago. And we had a lot of scientists. We had German scientists, Austrian scientists. We had American scientists. They learned how to create these atomic reactions, and I can't even go into the specifics of it. I'm not really all that knowledgeable about how it all works. But they managed to create the bomb in a lab. They do testing for several years. FDR dies in April of 45. He gets sick, dies. He traveled a lot. He was, of course, he had his own illnesses, and he had polio and whatnot. Truman takes over. Truman, VP, becomes president. He's informed of the bomb, that we have this bomb. He didn't even know about it. He had no knowledge till he became president. It was thought to be the most tightly guarded secret in America. Millions of people worked on it. Incredible amount of money was spent. It was, and I correct that, not millions of people, 200,000 people worked on the project. 200,000 people worked on the project. Millions were spent on the project. They developed the bombs. There's lots of reports written. I think there was 17 or 21 reports written about should we use the bomb, not use the bomb, what happens if we don't use the bomb, what's Japan going to do, are they going to keep fighting, etc., etc. And the rationale came to be known as the less loss of life rationale, the less loss of life. The idea being, if we drop the bombs, it's going to have a lot of casualties, a lot of death, but it will be a less loss. Some estimates said as many as 10 million people would die in an invasion of Japan. A lot of those being Americans, maybe 1 million, 2 million Americans, millions of Japanese would die, lots of other people would die, of course, other allies involved. And even though Germany was defeated, we had to get a final defeat of Japan. Germany, Italy was done. We had to get an official surrender of Japan. They wouldn't do it. We dropped the 2 bombs in Hiroshima, Nagasaki on the southern tip of the island. Japan does surrender. Eventually, just about a week later, around August 15th, Japan surrenders. We know now that we think those estimates were inflated. It would not have been nearly as... There are some estimates that said as many as 10 million people would die in an invasion of Japan. that was really grossly inflated. The numbers most historians now would say is most likely, logically, between 1 and 2 million deaths, which is still terrible, terribly catastrophic, 1 to 2 million deaths. The actual bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the immediate killing and the immediate after effects of the radiation and damage, about 250,000. Approximately 250,000 Japanese died. Far less than would have happened in a Japanese invasion. That no one really contests. The real controversy is the fact of the nuclear bombs themselves. And we also think Japan surrendered maybe not because of us. Because we've been firebombing the island of Japan for 4 years. For over 2 years, we've been firebombing Japan, hundreds of thousands of casualties, entire cities lost. Japan hadn't surrendered. They were training their kids in elementary schools. They had videos, movies, training elementary kids how to fight American soldiers they invade. So they were training 8-year-olds how to basically make weapons and fight in case American soldiers. Japan did appear to be willing to fight to the very end, literally to the last Japanese body. That's the appearance. But we think Japan ultimately probably surrendered because of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had already invaded and taken over Korea. So they were just a hop, skip, and a jump from invading Japan and to having a land invasion, which they probably would have done. So at any day, any week, any month, we could have seen the Soviets basically invade Japan and take over Japan. So we think Japan probably most likely surrendered because they didn't want to be conquered by the Soviets. If anything, they hated the Soviets more than us. They had been friendly with the U.S. for years. They had negotiations with us. They've been allies with us for years. We basically helped them industrialize. So in truth, they had a lot friendlier relations with the United States, even given everything that happened. They never really had friendly relations with China or the Soviets, communists. So Japan, high authority, high command, made a decision that they would prefer to hand their country over to the Americans than to hand their country over to the Soviets. So they surrendered to us. Had that not been the situation, they might have continued to hold out for weeks or months, and we might have had to use more bombs. Luckily, that didn't happen. War in the Pacific. I don't really need to go into detail on this. You can look at it, look over it. You can see different movements, Allied controlled territories. Some different invasions, movements of ships and troops, movement of armies. I don't really see anything else on here I need to cover necessarily. I think we're done. That's a lot, I know. Sorry it lasted so long, but it was really important and really significant stuff. And it comes to shape world history, well, for the rest of this class at least. We'll see you next time, folks. Ciao.